We found a statue of a woman down by the river. When I was 13 years old, my cousin and I found a golden statue by the river. We spent most afternoons down there. Eloise, or Lou as everyone called her, would be skipping rocks, or hanging upside down from the branches, while I looked at fish and bugs and leaves under my magnifying glass, referring to my books and writing down notes. I was picking some nice flowers to take home to my dad, when I looked over and saw a spark of gold sticking out of the mud. I called Lou over. It was half buried in the mud of the riverbank, and Lou used her water gun to squirt the dirt away so we could see it better. It was life-sized woman with a rose-covered veil over her face so only her mouth showed. Her head was downturned and cocked to the side, and her arms were down by her sides, the palms up. It kind of looked like she was shrugging. Lou squirted the base with water so the carved engravings showed. "Oh, it's in a different language," I said with disappointment. "Or hieroglyphics. I should bring my book on Egypt over." At that age I was deeply in my mythology phase. Lou sent me a funny look. "What are you talking about, Frankie?" she said, and I blinked. The carvings, that had been just symbols before, were suddenly readable English. "Hold my hand and make a wish," it read, and a loopy signature that said, "Rose gold." "Maybe it fell off a circus train or something," said Eloise. "You know, one of those creepy fortune-telling thingamajigs you see at carnivals." I watched as she got out her phone from her backpack to take a photo. The logical part of me said the words changing had just been my mind playing tricks on me. The animal part of me was completely unnerved. "I should run from this thing as fast as I could." "Gonna make a wish?" asked Lou with a grin. I flinched as she walked towards the statue and took one of its hands. "Jesus, don't touch it," I said at once. My heart felt like a swollen lump and a fresh cold sweat had broken on my forehead. "Oh my God, are you afraid of it?" Lou jeered. "What should I wish for?" "Well, it is Valentine's Day soon. Maybe I should wish for your dad to find a special someone to have a special time with." "Classy," I replied with a glare. My dad was a touchy subject. I lived with my Auntie Andy, my dad Sky, and Lou, except for every second weekend when she visited her dad. Lou's dad, Uncle Leith, used to have split custody, but he was a bit of a wreck, so now Lou lived with us basically permanently. Lou looked like a girly girl with her long blonde hair and rainbow dresses, but she was the complete opposite, more gross and wild than any boy in our class. I looked like a nerd with my big glasses and black plates, and was exactly how I looked, at the top of my class in everything but My dad, Sky, had an intellectual disability, and as soon as I found that out I went into research mode. I learned that it meant he had an IQ under 70, that intellectual disabilities are either mild, moderate, severe or profound. Dad's intellectual disability was mild. He could look after himself and didn't need a carer, but he had trouble understanding a lot of things. Auntie Andy and Uncle Leith had written a book that made enough money for them both to comfortably live off. My dad made a whole lot of teas, fragrances, soaps and bath bombs that he sent off to fancy shops that overpriced them. My mother was a mystery. Apparently my dad had just arrived home with me one day. Lou questioned why we were all so certain I even was my dad's daughter. "He could have just kidnapped me." She said it in a half-joking way, but it was odd that all the grown-ups just accepted I was his daughter. I didn't even look like him much, except for our dark hair. "Come on, make a wish, make a wish," Lou said. "You chicken shit." "Come on, what's the harm? It's just a dumb statue." "Monkey's paw," I muttered, and Lou frowned. We were the same age, but she hadn't read as much as I had. "What?" she said, and I shrugged. "Monkey's paw, you know, careful what you wish for, it'll go wrong," I said. "Like in the Treehouse of Horror episode." Understanding crossed Lou's face. "How can meeting a special person to have a special time with go wrong?" she said, "unless it means having a special time with the Grim Reaper." I imagine going back home to Auntie Andy crying and Dad dead on the ground. "I don't know what happened," she'd sob. "He just dropped dead out of nowhere." I felt a flutter of panic in my throat. Lou glanced at me guiltily. "Look, it's not even real," said Lou. "It's so grotty and cheap looking." It's just a bloody fortune-telling thing someone chucked out. I remembered the symbols changing with a blink of an eye to English. Had it just been my imagination? A dull clunk broke me from my thoughts. Lou had given the statue a mighty kick. "Dumb piece of crap," she said. "Come on Frankie, let's just go home. I'm starving anyway." With that, she walked off with her water gun over her shoulder, to the forest path that would take us back home. I lingered, staring down at the statue. It was a creepy thing to find out here in the forest, that's for certain. I didn't like being alone with it. I don't know how to explain the feeling. It just had a strange vibe about it, like thinking you'd seen a dark figure move out of the corner of your eye but then looking to see it was just a coat track. Not dangerous, just uneasy. With that, she walked off with her water gun over her shoulder, to the forest path that would take us back home. I lingered, staring down at the statue. It was a creepy thing to find out here in the forest, that's for certain. I didn't like being alone with it. I don't know how to explain the feeling. It just had a strange vibe about it, like thinking you'd seen a dark figure move out of the corner of your eye but then looking to see it was just a coat track. Not dangerous, just uneasy. Before I knew what I was doing, I was reaching over to take its hand. It was cold, slightly damp with river water and mud. I looked over my shoulder to make sure Lou was gone. Just a stupid statue, like throwing a coin in a wishing well. Just a dumb bit of fun. Might as well make the wish I'd been doing since I was 5 whenever I blew out my birthday candles. I whispered. I wish I knew about my mother. Nothing happened, of course. The statue just glinted in the morning sun. I wiped my hand off on my clothes and wandered off after Lou. At the end of the forest trail, we ducked under the bar that separated the trail from our dead-end street. Lou and I always got up earlier than everyone else to go explore the river. My auntie had no idea why we got up at dawn nearly every day. "River's not going anywhere, is it?" she'd say. Lou and I always found the walking path got too crowded during the day. Other kids swinging off the branch into the river and drenching my book while I was trying to look up different types of mosses. It was better first thing in the morning. There were still a couple of joggers about but they were quiet so we didn't mind them. Also getting up early meant I got to meet the postie every morning. He was scary looking but cool, tall and muscular with straggly gray hair that hung from the helmet over his face. He delivered my monthly science magazines and sometimes we'd have a chat about it before he got back on his motorbike. As Lou and I trundled over to the front gate, the postie pulled over on his bike. He passed me the morning mail, glancing at my muddy hand. "Digging for worms were ya?" he asked and I snorted. "That's what 5-year-olds do," I said. "I'm trying to find some freshwater mollusks from my latest magazine." "I thought you were looking for moss?" he said. "No, that was last month. This month is mollusks," I said. "Not bad to eat some of them," he said. "Maybe not the ones you find down the river though." "Of course not," I said as he got on his bike and drove off with a wave. I went through the front door that Lou had left open. My dad was curled up in the armchair with his latest knitting project in his lap. He often fell asleep there at night and forgot to go to bed. My dad had shaggy brown hair and big brown eyes and often had a pensive expression on his face like he was off in his own world. Auntie was sitting at the table with a coffee, looking exhausted. My aunt was blonde and blue-eyed like Lou, her upper teeth stuck out and her eyes went in different directions. Auntie did odd jobs around the neighborhood like putting up fences and mowing lawns. The book money meant she didn't need to work but she still did so she wouldn't die of boredom as she once told me. It was better than Uncle Leith who just smoked weed all day and played his guitar on the porch until his neighbors complained. "Hello," she said with a yawn as I put the mail on the table in front of her. "Get some nice flowers for Dad?" "Yeah," I said, as I put the bag at the foot of Dad's armchair. "Just some daisies and bottle brushes." "Nice," said Auntie Andy. Over at the pantry, Lou was climbing the shelves and grabbing as much food as she could get her hands on. "Bloody Nora," Auntie Andy snapped at her and Lou looked around, mouth stuffed full of pretzels. "Get down from there, actin' like you've never been fed." Lou shrugged, grabbing the peanut butter and jumping down. The thump of her shoes woke up my dad. "Morning," Auntie Andy said to him. "You need to stop sleeping in the armchair. It'll screw up your back." "Sorry," said Dad, sleepily rubbing his eye. He looked at the bag of flowers on the floor and smiled, bending down to go through it. "Thank you," he said to me. "Wanna see what we found in the river?" Lou said to her mother with her mouth full of food. Auntie Andy just shrugged as Lou felt around for her phone. "Come on Uncle Sky, do you wanna see it?" Lou said, getting out her phone. My dad limped over to her curiously. He'd had a bad leg my whole life. Lou tapped for a few seconds and then showed them the photo. I jumped at the loud crashing sound. Auntie Andy had dropped her cup. Hot coffee splashed everywhere. Lou stared at her mother in shock. Auntie Andy's face had fallen into an expression of pure horror. Lou and I stared with fright as my dad wrapped his arms around himself. His breathing was getting harsh and short. I thought he was going to hyperventilate. Auntie Andy stood up, put her arm around him and herded him from the room. Lou and I were left alone in the kitchen. We stared at each other. "What the hell?" said Lou. "We found a statue of a woman down by the river, Part 2, The Great Scam Pan." About an hour after my dad's and aunt's freak out over the photo, Uncle Leith came over and took Lou and me to get takeaway. Dad had locked himself in his room and I could hear his harsh, scared breathing behind the door. I'd eavesdropped on Auntie Andy on the phone. "I'm trying not to have a meltdown, Leith," she had said. "Please can you come over and take the girls out for a bit? I need to calm down and then I need to calm Sky down and then I need to work out what the hell's going on. I don't want the girls to see me like this." Growing up, I always looked down my nose at Uncle Leith. There was this helplessness about him. Unlike Auntie Andy and my dad, Uncle Leith didn't work, just lived off the money from the book. His hair was messy, he didn't shave. He smelled of cigarette smoke, booze and weed and he just looked grubby and unwashed. There was always this dazed look in his eyes, like he was in a perpetual state of shock. In hindsight, I think I judged him too hard. He picked us up in his lemon of a car and we drove in silence to get burgers and chips. "You wanna go play in the playground?" he murmured. He was worse than usual, his eyes completely glazed over and boggling, mouth hanging half open, moving like he was in slow motion. "We're a bit old for it now," I said. Uncle Leith just nodded, picking at his food. "What's wrong with Mum and Uncle Sky?" asked Lou in a tiny voice. Lou was always quiet with her dad, barely saying a word compared to her usual chatterbox self. I think she was a bit embarrassed and didn't know how to react to him. It's too hard to explain," said Uncle Leith. Then he reached into the glove box and passed us both a book each. I recognized it as the one he'd written with Auntie Andy. I was an avid reader but I'd never been interested in my family's book. I'd never read a memoir before, more interested in fiction and science. It was a very slim little paperback and the title read, The Great Scam Pan. On the front was a picture I recognized from Greek mythology of the god Pan, with the upper half of a man and the lower half of a goat. On the back I saw a black and white photo of Aunt Andy and Uncle Leith looking very young and very serious. "Just read it and you'll get it," said Uncle Leith. He drove us back home and let us out. Lou and I walked nervously inside the house. Aunt Andy looked up from the couch with a beer can in her hand. Dad was curled up on his armchair, sucking on his knuckles. "Sorry for scaring you girls," she said. "Did Leith explain?" I just showed the book to her. She nodded. "It's better said in there," she said. "We did have editors making it sound good and all that." She finished off the beer, crushing the can in the hand. Lou and I went to our bedrooms. I opened the book up. In the back was a few photos. Some were from the newspapers and showed Andy, Leith and Sky looking very young and frightened, huddled up together. The headlines said stuff like "Survivors of Secret Cult and Terrorized Children Speak Out." The next photo was of the golden statue we'd found in the river standing in the middle of a clean, white sterile-looking laboratory. with a few people gathered around her with notepads and mysterious machinery. One of the photos was of Auntie Undy in a hospital bed with Uncle Leith awkwardly carrying a newborn Lou like she was a sack of flour. The last photo was of my dad, on the porch seat out back. Sticking out of the top of his jumper was a little dark-haired toddler. He was reading me a book. I remember as a kid, constantly being carried around by Dad in his coat or jumper. He was always reluctant to put me down. My first memory was being somewhere warm and cozy and looking up to see big dark brown eyes peering down at me. It felt strange to see the memory in photo form. I don't remember Dad reading me the book, but I do remember feeling safe and comfortable. I opened up the book and began to read. While Leith, formerly known as just Leaf, and I were writing this book, my father Liam Arcadia, formerly Liam Paulson, was found not guilty of ritualistic murder. Everyone else in his little cult went on the stand to defend him, and it was the word of a bunch of kids versus dozens of adults. According to them, all we young people just committed mass suicide for no reason. I must admit a lot of our story sounds batshit insane. Yet the authorities actually had Rose Gold in their possession for a long time before she went missing. So she's not a lie. I'm going to skip a lot of the minor details of my early life. I know everyone just wants to know how it all went down, how the secret cult fell apart, the sequence of events that led to us escaping it all. My father Liam founded the community in the late 60s. It's a common story. A lot of cults start this way. He ran a spiritual class, then the power got to his head and he ran off with a dozen members to hide out in the forest away from society. The community was pretty much just Liam taking bits from pagan religions and the free love movement and warping them to his liking. We worshipped Pan, focusing on the fact he was the god of the wild and music and was linked with sex and fertility. A life of emulating Pan was pretty enticing, and Liam gathered up a huge group of people wanting to dance, drink and screw all night and day. A lot of pagans honor a mother and father goddess and god. It can really be whoever you like, whoever you feel an affinity to. It can be from Celtic, Greek, Norse, Egyptian, or any other mythology that speaks to you. To worship your god or goddess of choice, you prayed and gave offerings to them. The horror films tell you all pagans want to sacrifice people as offerings to their hell god. In reality, most offerings are just nice wine, flowers, pretty trinkets, artwork, or anything you'd think the god or goddess would enjoy. On the surface, our secret community looked like a hell of a lot of fun. Worshipping Pan meant it was just non-stop party. What a great way to live, right? You didn't have to dig very deep to discover we were actually a fucked up mess. We were the first generation to have been born and raised in the community. Older siblings had been brought along by their parents, who were the first members. Among the little kids and teenagers, it was honestly hard to keep up with who belonged to what father. There was so much sex. Our mothers just had no idea. You see Liam's badly thought out utopia quickly falling apart. We had been raised to believe getting crushes was a taboo, because people our own age might be a sibling. Us girls shouldn't get a crush on an older man cause he might be our dad. There was always a secret fear of accidental incest about the community. We would never have lasted very long because we would have absolutely ended up interbreeding and then dying off from it. My mother had my brother Sky with a different father. The adults gossiped about how Liam had started getting problems performing as he got older, which meant we didn't have any other siblings. Sky being slow and me being ugly, it was called incredibly ironic that we were the only safe bets among the teenagers. The whole community, although it preached free love, was whiter than snow. I only met people who weren't white after I left. We still found a way to discriminate on appearance though. See, Liam was blonde, so all the blondes in the community felt superior to the brunettes. I know, we didn't even have redheads. The girls tended to buy into the whole blonde versus brunette rubbish more than the boys. Not saying the boys didn't bully each other, but it just wasn't over hair color. They were more likely to pick on Sky cause he was a bit slow, or make fun of me for being ugly and worm-ridden. Being an isolated community, We tried to avoid doctors as much as possible. I'd suffered from worms all through my childhood, and because it had gone untreated for so long I was pretty malnourished as a result. Now I'm blonde, but I'd had the worms and also had an overbite and was wall-eyed, so I was still an outcast. Juniper, or Jupiter as she was called growing up, was the biggest outcast out of us as she was overweight and brunette. The three other brunettes, Wren or Gwen as she secretly called herself, Fern and Hazel, had made a little group and looked down on the rest of us. I'd rather be with them, but even though I was an outcast I was still blonde and an enemy in their eyes. So our father god was Pan and our mother goddess was Rose Gold. No one paid much attention to Rose Gold. We thought she was a bit of a weird quirk of Liam's. He told us the story of how he'd found a golden statue in our valley and believed it was special enough to worship. To all of us, it just looked like a grotty-looking sculpture of a woman with a veil over her eyes. It stood in the middle of the marshy area around the river. Despite everything I'm going to tell you, I didn't ever get an evil vibe off Rose Gold. She made us all nervous, that's for sure. No one liked to be alone with her. It was a common dare to go stand by her in the middle of the night, and no one lasted long doing that, running back after 10 minutes at most. After I left this community, an investigator explained what Rose Gold was like to him. She was like when you went into one of those Christian or Catholic churches all by yourself and looked at the God's mom statue, Mother Mary or whatever. It was just eerie being around her, like she was somehow alive and watching. That's a good word. Rose Gold didn't feel evil or malicious, just very eerie. The community was based in a clearing down in the valley. There were jute and hemp fields that we made fabrics out of for our clothes, bedding and tents. We grew fruit trees, kept a few goats for milk and cheese and chickens for eggs, had a veggie garden and grew wheat to make basic breads. We didn't eat meat, and when I left I found it was one of the biggest culture shocks learning most people ate animals. I still find the thought of eating a living creature absolutely bizarre. To me it would be like eating a hunk of human flesh. But to each their own. I just wasn't raised that way. So we followed the wheel of the year, which meant we had a celebration nearly every season. This all happened around the spring equinox celebration called Ustra. We'd embroider rabbits onto our clothes and have egg-based meals, them having to do with fertility and all that. Really, it was an excuse to party and drink, just with nicer food to eat and better clothes to wear. So every year at Ostra we had a little opening ritual that I found out later Liam had completely made up himself. We bustled around the podium in our best outfits, white tunics for the men and white dresses for the women, all with the rabbit embroidery on the sleeves and hems. Liam took the stage. He was dressed in brown robes with a horned headband in his blonde hair, emulating the god Pan. He was carrying a crochet blanket in his hands that was covering something. We all bustled forward closer. Liam looked around us, letting the suspense build. Then he whipped the blanket away. Underneath was a little effigy of Rose Gold. At the base of the statue was a panel that said, "No and go." "No Kothpo?" said Liam as he held the effigy above his head. "Or go Kothpo?" I always thought this opening ritual a waste of time. Why couldn't we go straight to the food and dancing? Still, I joined in the chanting of, "No Kothpo, no Kothpo, no Kothpo." The odd opening ritual was the only time we ever did anything to do with Rose Gold. Every time the word no would glow more brightly, everyone would cheer and start the party. We were all struck into a dead silence as for the first time in my life, the word go glowed more brightly. Liam saw our faces and lowered the effigy, staring at it, mouth hanging open. All of us kids exchanged confused glances. The grown-ups looked absolutely horrified. "When's the party starting?" one of the little kids said, tugging on his mother's sleeve. "I'm hungry, Mama." Finally, Liam cleared his throat, looking over at us. "Rose Gold has spoken," he said, his voice hoarse. "Go Kothpo." As we set up the cushions and table for the food, There was a somber energy in the air that I'd never experienced at a seasonal celebration before. All of the kids were looking at each other with utter confusion as we sat cross-legged on the cushions. Liam took his place at the head of the table. "Let us commence the morning feast," he said. Then he reached for his first piece of bread. After he'd taken a sip of wine and a bite of bread, we all started to eat as well. There was no chatter or joking around like other years. The adults were either dead quiet or whispering worriedly behind their hands at each other. "He only invented the Kothpo to get rid of Carter," I heard one of the grown-ups whisper at the dinner table. "This is bullshit. I didn't sign up to be murdered. I thought this was supposed to be fun." One woman touted and shook her head. "You did sign up for this," she said. "We all did. Nothing in life is easy. We barely do a thing for Rose Gold and you can't even do this one thing for her." At the head of the table, Liam nodded. "The Kothpo isn't just mindless cruelty," he called across at us. "We are a community of pleasure, which means we're constantly growing. If we get too big, we won't be sustainable and collapse. This is a very unpleasant sacrifice. But that's what life is all about." Would you rather sacrifice your freedom to love and be one with nature and to connect your souls with others, or sacrifice just a few of us to keep our community strong and safe? All of us kids were growing more uneasy as we slowly realized what the Kothpo was. None of us had signed up for this. We'd been born into the community. We had to do whatever our parents did. "Now at the end of the morning feast, we shall pick an age group at random to participate in the Kothpo," said Liam. As the 30s through to 40s participated in the first Kothpo, they will have immunity from this one. Teenagers through to 20s and 50s through to 60s shall be in the running to participate this year. Whoever isn't chosen is guaranteed to participate in the third Kothpo and then we'll reset again for the fourth. If you are 12 and under or 70 and over, you are exempt from the Kothpo. When he saw our drawn, frightened faces, he raised his wine glass. 3 men and 3 women will emerge victorious," he said. "Their prize for surviving will be the opportunity to share in a love session with the great god Pan himself." He said it like it was a good thing we should be excited about. Everyone knew that whenever we were blessed with a meeting from Pan, it was really just Liam wearing a goat leg costume. Sharing a love session with Pan pretty much just mean having an orgy with Liam. You're probably thinking, wait, the prize is a romp with Pan, but teenagers were a part of the Kothpo. Was Liam going to sleep with underage kids? The answer was unfortunately yes. 13 and over you were free game to the grown-ups. We didn't think anything of it. We were a bit grossed out but accepting. I was never preyed upon, but others in my age range definitely were. It was just normal to us though. If you'd have told us it's wrong and messed up that adults want to have sex with you, we'd have been gobsmacked. We'd been raised to think this was just how life was. I saw the whispering grown-ups ahead of me exchange looks, raising their eyebrows. One whispered, "It's gonna be the young ones of course. Finally he gets another chance with Polly." I looked at Sky across the table, stirring his cup of iced tea. Who was Polly and Carter, you might be wondering? They were Sky's parents. Apparently Liam was infatuated with Polly and had created the Kothpo just to get rid of Carter. Carter had just turned 30 and Polly and Liam were both 29 when the first Kothpo happened. The 30s through to 40s were drawn. After Carter had died, Liam quickly swooped on Polly, who fell pregnant with me and then died while giving birth. Sky had suffered some mysterious trauma when he turned 13. For a few years he refused to speak and would cry hysterically. Sky, who was a splitting image of his mother that Liam was obsessed with. No one said anything, but we all had a good idea about what might have happened to Sky. None of the adults had ever explained to us what the Kothpo even was until now. Maybe if they had, there'd have been more runaways. I think it was Leith who figured out that Liam had just squashed the term "control the population" into something short and snappy. Liam tried to have us believe Rose Gold chose our fate, but this wasn't the cursed Rose Gold statue. It was just an imitation. He'd created a little rose gold effigy and it was solar powered. It lay in the sun all year. Then when he took it out and flicked a switch, Either no or go would have absorbed the most energy and glow the strongest. After the feast was over, Liam picked up the effigy again. Will the 50s through to 60s know or go the Kothpo? He asked. We all stared as he put the effigy up above his head. We all watched as the word no glowed out. There was a harsh exhale from the entire community. Rose Gold has spoken, he said. The 50s through to 60s will not go the Kotopo, therefore the teens through to 20s will go the Kothpo. The grown-ups all reacted at once, some bursting into tears, others reaching to hug us young people who were just staring around, completely baffled. Just imagine every year of your childhood your Easter celebration was a great time full of food and fun you greatly looked forward to. Then out of nowhere one year your family tells you instead of a celebration they're gonna send you to death instead. It was like a bizarre dream. All of the little kids were getting increasingly upset and confused. The sadness of the adults seemed melodramatic and put on. The little kids, however, were genuine. I don't want them to die. A lot of them were crying to their mothers, burying their faces in their mothers' dresses. Why can't they stay? It's not fair. I hate Rose Gold. Their mothers hushed them nervously. Now we shall prepare for the funeral march, said Liam. This is time for everyone to say their goodbyes. Then at 3 in the morning the men shall take the raft to the river and the women will go to Rose Gold for the dance. The survivors will shoot a flare to signal the end of the Kothpo and go to the clearing of love for their prize. The goodbyes were just mainly made up of mothers hugging their shell-shocked children who were standing around uselessly, not knowing what the hell to do. The next few hours were a blur and 3 o'clock crept up fast and deadly. We were herded like sheep to the edge of the forest. Some of the adults grabbed their instruments, normally used for a big dance and sing along. This time they began to play mournful music, like we did when people died. Others grabbed what we used as a table, raising it up above their heads. They walked it over to the boys who took a hold of it. I realized if you flipped it over, it could be used as a raft. There were 10 girls and young women who were a part of the dance. Myself, Daffodil, Belladonna, Juniper, Wisteria, Hazel, Winter, Briar, Wren and Fern. The 8 boys and young men going down the river were Leaf, Sky, Morris, Robin, Rowan, Glenn, Blaze and Forrest. Belladonna and Glenn were the oldest and expecting a baby. Wisteria and Blaze were the youngest, only 13 years old. Don't worry about remembering any of their names. As you might have gathered, you won't have to memorize most of them. I suggest you don't get too attached to anyone either. Liam put his hands up to the sky. Then he cried out, "Let the Kotopo begin." I was distracted from my reading by a commotion in the lounge room. I put down the book. Outside the window, I saw that the day was turning into evening, the sky darkening into navy. I went into the corridor and peered into the lounge room. There was movement beside me and I turned to see Lou peering over my shoulder. "Who the fuck is out there?" Andy hissed, staring out of a crack in the curtains. On the armchair, my dad was curled up with his head buried in his arms, trembling. Lou and I tried to peer through one of the windows. Andy spotted us and glowered. "Get back to your rooms," she said, frantically waving her hand at us. We couldn't see anything in the wilds of the garden. My heart was in my throat. Was Rose Gold somewhere in the darkness, waiting for us? I imagined the statue rising from the mud of the riverbank, floating down the walking path towards our house. Or would her legs move in unnatural spasms, creaking and squeaking as she made her way towards us? Then Lou beside me let out a sharp gasp, grabbing onto my arm. I looked over at where she was staring. In the window I could see a figure. Not the veiled golden face, but an old man with long white hair and a yellow-toothed smile. When Andy saw him all the color drained from her face. Then she bounded over, sweeping Lou and I up and shepherding us towards the armchair which she stood over, protectively shielding us and her brother from view. "Fuck off!" she screamed at the old man. "Get the fuck out of here." My dad burst into a fresh wave of tears. The old man kept staring at us with his sharp blue eyes. "That's no way to talk to her father, Dandelion," he said, and then cocked his head to the side. "Hello, Sky. Is that Eloise and Francis too? I've heard about them in your book, but I've never had the pleasure of meeting them." Andy grabbed her phone. "Get away from my family or I'm calling the cops." Liam from the book. What was he doing here? After 13 years, why had he come here now? The old man's smile fell away and he stared at us with an unsettling hungry expression. "It's funny," he said. "I had a dream that rose gold led me to my daughter's store. This was meant to be, Dandelion. We were meant to be reunited. You can't fight fate." Andy started tapping in the number to the cops. Liam moved quickly away from the window, running off and away into the night with startling speed. "Why would Rose Gold bring him here?" Andy said in a small voice after she'd gotten off the phone with the police. My dad slowly peered up from his arms, staring at Lou and me with his big brown eyes. "You made wishes," he said to us. After a few moments, Lou and I nodded. Andy let out a long rattling breath. "Monkey's paw," said Dad. We found a statue of a woman down by the river, Part 3, the Kothpo. Andy wouldn't let us back in our rooms. She gathered up blankets and pillows and kept us all in the lounge room. "Is Liam gonna hurt us?" I said with my blanket up to my eyes. The two winced in surprise, obviously forgetting for a moment that I'd read about him in the book. "No, I've told the police and they're on the way now," said Aunt Andy. "I'm gonna call for your uncle to come here as well." I feel like she was trying to downplay the situation to keep us calm. "Can we have the books?" asked Lou. "I want to read the rest." Aunt Andy shifted uncomfortably on the spot before getting to her feet. She nearly ran for the corridor. I felt like the dark window was watching us. I wish we could draw the blinds, but I didn't want to get up and go over. I buried my face away in my blankets. "Here you go," said Aunt Andy, reappearing with the books. Dad got up from the couch. "Cup of tea?" he said in his quiet voice. "Hot chocolate?" He limped around the kitchen, getting us all hot drinks. I opened up the book and continued reading. Dandelion of course can't tell you what happened on the river, so I'll let you know. We walked, single file out of the clearing. The rest of the community were playing mournful music, thumping drums like a funeral dirge. As we approached the river, we broke into two groups, the boys putting the raft down at the riverbed, the girls continuing into the forest. There were teary faces and sniffling everywhere. All of us boys climbed into the raft and Glenn pushed us into the water before climbing in after us. We began to drift gently away. Our little lethal river trip had begun, including me. There were 8 guys on the raft. Morris, formerly Luna, had come out as trans when we were kids. I used to think that although the cult was terrible, the one good thing about it was that it wasn't bigoted. Morris only got flack for not changing his name to something nature-themed. Dandelion pointed out to me later that Liam's little love party only had white people in it, so all the adults were most likely racist. I hadn't even realized that. Then there was Sky. Something happened to him a few years before. He'd always been a bit slower than the rest of us, but suddenly he stopped talking and was prone to crying fits. It took a few years, but finally he'd begun to talk again, although it was limited. He clung to Morris like a security blanket, who was very protective of him. Glenn was the oldest of us and expecting a child with one of the girls, Belladonna. Blaze, who was the youngest of us at 13, had a bad squint and in hindsight probably should have been wearing glasses. But our backwards little cult didn't accept that. Then there was Forrest, who was a big gangling joker. Finally there were the 2 twins, Robin and Rowan. The funeral music had changed to something strange and ominous. We all shifted uncomfortably on the raft. "We're pretty lucky," said Rowan. "There's not as much of us compared to the girls. It will be hard to lose so many of them." "Yeah, but all they have to do is dance," said Blaze. "It's bullshit that we have to row down the river and they just have a party." Blaze was the most bitter of us and I didn't blame him. He'd only just turned 13. If the Kothpo had been done literally a week earlier, he would have been safe. It seemed particularly unfair that he had to participate. "Seriously?" said Morris, glaring at him. "They're dancing to the death. They're not allowed to stop for a second. At least we get to have a lie down. Most of us are going to have a pretty chill fucking death compared to them. What would you prefer, just quickly drowning or dying of hypothermia? Argued Blaze. Cause we're getting the long, slow death. I don't know if it's just me, but I prefer neither of those, said Forrest to bitter smiles from the rest of us. Flowers, said Sky, leaning down to scoop up petals from the river surface. He sniffed them and then smiled. Roses. Blaze just sneered. Yeah, roses, Sky, aren't they pretty? Said Morris, the harsh look on his face softening. Speaking of roses, said Forrest, and we looked over at him. You know, compared to Pan, Rose Gold's pretty crap at throwing a party, said Forrest, and this got laughs even from Blaze. Tell me about it, muttered Rowan. She's a bloody mull, isn't she? Yeah, what a slag, Forrest said in an exaggerated old voice. What a fucking slag. He started clapping his hands together. Rose Gold, you're mold. Na 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 na. Rose Gold, you're old. Na 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 na, he chanted. Come on guys, join in. Laughing, I started to clap and chant as well, along with the twins. Sky was giggling and Morris and Blaze were smirking and shaking their heads. Rose Gold, you're mold. Na na, na na na. Rose Gold, you're old. Na na, na na na. You're like 24 years old, Forrest, said Blaze, although he was amused. How is it that I'm more mature than you? Maturity is for suckers. I'm gonna be immature till I die, Forrest replied. Which will probably be in a few hours, let's be real. Blaze snorted. I'm wondering if dying will be better? Said Rowan. I don't wanna have an orgy with any of you guys, and especially not Liam. Sky stopped laughing at once. He stared down at the river, fiddling around with one of the flower petals. If you could pick any of the girls to survive, who would it be? Asked Forrest. All of us teenagers cringed at once. Well, only the older ones obviously, said Rowan. Anyone under 20 might be a sister, you know. So like Winter, Briar, Daffodil and Belladonna. No offense Glenn. Glenn just shrugged. Sex apparently helps a baby get born, so I don't mind, he said. It come out with a big dent in its head though, said Forrest at once to peals of laughter from all of us. Flatter yourself much? Said Rowan, elbowing Forrest. The night drew on as we swatted mosquitoes and chatted aimlessly. This whole river cruise to the death wasn't too bad yet. I reckoned we had lucked out compared to the girls. Most of us were probably going to just quietly freeze to death, and at least we were doing it in nice calm company. You've barely said a word, Robin, I said after a while. You okay? Robin swallowed roughly. Just feeling a bit seasick, he said. And you know, bloody scared of dying of course. Aren't we all? Morris muttered sympathetically. He reached down the front of his shirt and then pulled a rope and bag out. We all looked at him. Managed to sneak some food on, he said, and all of us but Blaze crowed delightedly as he opened up the bag. Inside were hunks of bread and cheese. That's so stupid, Blaze snapped at Morris. The whole point of keeping food from us is to kill us off. The faster people die, the faster this is over. You don't have to have it, Morris countered as the rest of us eagerly grabbed handfuls. Forrest wiggled a chunk of cheese in front of Blaze's glaring face. Come on, you know you want it, he said in a sing-song voice. Yum, yum, yum. Blaze slapped his hand away. Still, after a few moments, he reached for the food as well. This will be a last meal for a lot of us, said Glenn as we ate. I've always wanted to be a dad. I was so excited when Belladonna got pregnant. What if we both get wiped out? I think both of you getting wiped out is the second best option, said Morris. It'll be so much worse if one of you survives and the other doesn't. Glenn nodded. That's true, he said. If one of us has to die, I hope it's me. If she dies, she's taking the baby with her. I hope you both make it, I said, and everyone else nodded. To Belladonna and Glenn making it, said Forrest, raising his piece of bread. Then he laughed as though figuring out a joke. A toast, he said, motioning at the bread, and we all groaned at the bad pun. Still, we all knocked our bits of bread together. To Belladonna and Glenn making it, we said, and to us soon-to-be deceased suckers, an easy death, said Forrest. Here, we all said back. We fell silent. Sky yawned. Might as well get some sleep, said Glenn. I'd say see you in the morning, but who knows if I'll make it through the night, said Forrest as he lay down on the raft. Sweet dreams everyone. We all muttered good nights as we laid down to sleep. It was hard to doze off. I felt my icy cold skin crawling with mosquitoes. It was freezing and I tried to tug at my tunic to cover more of my exposed skin, tried to breathe on my hands for warmth. I'd never been that cold in my life and would never be that cold again. It felt like ice water had replaced my blood. Shards of cold stabbing into my bones. Every exposed bit of skin was numb. I did drift off, but I don't know if it was into a proper sleep or into a hypothermia-induced unconsciousness. All I know is that I must have fallen asleep, because I was woken again later in the night. There was screaming far away in the forest. It sounded like the girls, all wailing and sobbing together. I looked around the group. Everyone was still alive, although Robin looked very ill, sallow with vomit trickling down the side of his mouth. The screaming got louder and more intense. None of us said a word, just silently floating down the black water. People over by the statue had obviously begun to drown. The music was feverish, maniacal, all crashing drums and low droning that made my icy skin prickle. It mixed up with the wails of the girls like they were some kind of horrible chorus, singing along. Then there were crashing footsteps through the forest. We all shrunk up together. I became aware of a presence at the riverbank, but I couldn't see what it was in the darkness. Come on. A voice that sounded like Hazel said. Come on, get off the raft. Come on. The voice of Fern called. This is bullshit. We don't have to do this. It's a hallucination, said Blaze at once. Guys, we're all getting hypothermia. We're gonna start seeing and hearing things. Alright, don't go plunging into the goddamn river. How are we all having the same vision? Rowan countered. Maybe it's a trick, said Forrest nervously. Maybe it's rose gold and she's trying to get us to run into the water? There was a scream of frustration. You're gonna die on that river, yelled what sounded like Gwen. Don't you understand? Robin staggered forward, his eyes clouded over with sickness. He crashed into the water and began to doggy paddle forward. No! Screamed Rowan. You're already sick. You can't take the cold. We watched helplessly as Rowan jumped in after him. Come on, come on. The voices of the girls yelled out. The twin brothers swam through the black water towards their voices. Soon they had reached the riverbank. Careful of the... Morris tried to yell, but Robin had already clambered onto the mossy rocks. He slipped at once and cracked his head on the rock. Rowan let out a hoarse, choked scream. We all beckoned and yelled after him, but he didn't seem to hear us. He looked absolutely lost as he cradled his brother, just staring after us with faraway eyes. He remained in the icy cold water, watching us disappear down the river. The raft kept floating on and soon we lost sight of him. The voices of the three girls had fallen quiet. I wondered if they'd ever been there at all. I still don't know what was out there that night, if it was actually the girls or something else. No one said a word. Sky was breathing heavily, voice harsh and short. Morris was mindlessly stroking Sky's hair in an automatic soothing motion. Forrest's eyes were full barely subdued terror, endlessly licking his lips. Glenn had his knees to his chest, burying his face away. I didn't know how long we traveled for, time melting together into a mindless blur. I could see that the dawn was breaking. The black night sky was shot through with pink streaks, the golden sun rising over the horizon. I bet you all want me to die, Blaze said suddenly. You're all against me, I can tell. No one's against you, I said at once. We don't want anyone to die. Bullshit, said Blaze. Forrest is funny. Glenn has a baby on the way. You're the nice guy and Morris and Sky are boyfriends or whatever. Then there's me, just some kid no one likes. You all secretly want me to go next. He got to his feet and the raft teetered to and fro. We all clutched to the sides, trying not to be flung into the water. Sit down, you idiot. Morris snarled. That's it, You just think I'm a dumb kid, don't you?" Blaze screamed, stamping his foot. Water surged onto the raft as we tried to keep it steady. "Yeah, I do. You're trying to capsize the boat cause of a temper tantrum," Morris sneered back. "I didn't know they let toddlers do the Kothpo." Blaze launched at him in a fury of flying fists. Morris grappled with him, trying to block the attacks and push him away. Hit back, you talk shit and you can't even take a punch," Blaze was shouting. "Calm down," yelled Glenn. "What's the matter with you?" Sky had his arms over his head, rocking on the spot, his eyes clenched shut. I exchanged looks with Forrest. The raft was approaching a low-hanging branch. Blaze was going to be knocked down. "Duck," I said, but Blaze was too in a rage to notice. "Duck." With a thump, Blaze was smacked in the back of the head and fell into the water. Morris immediately scrabbled to his knees, sticking out his hand. "Grab my hand, come on, we'll get you back on," he shouted as Blaze splashed desperately in the water. He grabbed Morris's hand, tugging hard. I still don't know if he did it on purpose or if it was accident. I like to think it was an accident that Blaze didn't try to take Morris down with him. "No!" screamed Sky as Morris hit his chin on the edge of the raft, crashing into the river as well. The two of them disappeared under the surface. "No, no, no, please," Sky sobbed as the raft floated away. We couldn't see them in the dark water. The current was growing faster, more dangerous. Almost as if nature was trying to fasten this all up for us. Soon the patch of water where they'd fallen had disappeared over the horizon. I put my arms around Sky, who has breathing harshly, face a terrified mask. It's okay," I said as his breath got shorter until he was heaving for oxygen. I thought he was going to pass out. The sky was pink and yellow. As the early morning drew on, birds were waking up, chirping away like it was any other normal day. The light illuminated the bushes and trees along the river, and in my fear they looked jagged and threatening, the bird song like cawing vultures. "The last of us," Glenn whispered, hugging his knees to his chest, burying his face away. "The last of us. Just let this be over." There was a burst of laughter and I looked up and saw Forrest with a wide grin, pointing somewhere in the distance. Looking over, I saw nothing but the pink sunrise. Forrest kept on laughing and laughing. "Rose gold, you're old, you're mold, as old as the sun." "No, no, much older," with white gnashing teeth," Forrest screamed, eyes bugging, froth at his cracked lips. "She'll never be satisfied. She's always hungry." Moloch and darkness and decay and the rose death held imitable sway over them all. "Leave us be, Queen Bee. Leave us be, Queen Bee." The last word was stretched out into a maniacal wail as he clutched at his neck. His nails dug into the flesh as he began to claw and rip, choking on the blood as he tore out his own throat. Red liquid gushed down his white tunic as he fell to his knees. He fell into the water, still trying to scream through his mangled vocal cords. I clutched at Sky, who was sobbing into my shoulder. Glenn and I watched the body float away, face contorted into a grotesque grinning mask. No one said a word. The current had calmed again and the raft gently floated over to a bend in the river, hitting the bank and coming to a stop. I wonder if we would have reached the river bend if Forrest was still with us. If we had all died earlier, would the river bend have appeared out of nowhere? Was nature waiting for us to get down to 3 before ending the trip for us? Silently, we climbed out of the raft. We were all trembling in the cold and shock, standing close together for warmth. The Kothpo was over. We had survived. We found a statue of a woman down by the river. Part 4, The Dance. Dad was having a nap on his armchair and his face was twisted up, eyelids fluttering with sleep. He was twisting, shuddering, mouth wide open with distress. Aunt Andy went over and put an arm around his shoulders. "I don't want a bath," he was whispering under his breath. "I don't want a bath, I don't want a bath, I don't want a bath," he repeated. I ducked my head into the corridor. Aunt Andy was hugging him and stroking his hair comfortingly. Without thinking, I ran over. Aunt Andy gave me a sharp look. "Not right now." she tried to say, but when my dad saw me he managed a weak smile. He opened up his arms and I climbed into them. I hadn't really given Dad a proper hug in years, telling him I was too old for it. I immediately felt like I was 4 years old again. He had a soothing warm smell like chai tea and wool. He seemed to settle, his breathing not as panicked anymore. We girls broke apart from the boys, walking towards the marsh. Everyone was miserable as we walked on. This would be the last time we'd see most of the boys alive and vice versa. We'd grown up together. Sure, a lot of the boys save a few liked to tease me, but that didn't mean I wanted to see them all die. Later on, when I was out of all of this, I read that there were experiments on non-Newtonian liquid, called oabalek. People filmed themselves walking across a pool of it without sinking. The second they stopped moving they began to sink in it. The marsh had an area of non-Newtonian liquid where the dance would take place. You couldn't stop dancing even for a moment or you'd be swallowed up. There was a small chunk of earth in the middle where the statue was, but the base was covered with barbed wire, nails and broken glass. Even if you did go to the patch of stable earth for a break, you could only balance by grabbing the base and slicing your arms up. Apparently in the first Kothpo someone had ended up bleeding to death, hanging onto the base of the statue. I don't know, what sounds worse to you? Fern was saying to Hazel as we walked through the forest. I think I'd rather bleed out. I'd rather drown, it sounds more peaceful, Hazel replied in an uncertain voice. I'd rather win, said Briar at the front of the line. I'm not making plans on how to die. It's completely defeatist. Why not just slit your throat, save us some time? Wow, Briar, said Gwen. Great words of encouragement there. Briar just sent her a withering look. I think a lot of us felt defeated already. We kinda just accepted Briar was a shoo-in to win. She was as fit as a horse and got up early every morning to run. There was also a quiet agreement that we'd do anything to make sure Belladonna won. Being pregnant, we weren't sure who'd take the third spot though, but we were certain Briar and Belladonna would be fine. Then there was me, underweight and malnourished worm girl, Juniper, who was nicknamed after the biggest planet in the galaxy, and Daffodil, who suffered from asthma. People kept sending us sympathetic looks. I think people had pretty much given up on us. The glint of gold shone in the distance. A feeling of dread hung over the line of girls and women as we approached it. The ground beneath us was getting muddier, more watery by the second. Then the trees thinned out and we were in the area of marsh with rose gold in the center. We waited for a few moments as the funeral dirge ended. Then, another more ominous tune started. Later on, when I left this place, I learned that the song they played was The Rite of Spring, replaying it over and over again throughout the night. One of the older girls, Winter, turned around to us. She sent us a small, sad smile. She'd been given the flare to carry and she put it on the wedge of a tree for when the Kothpo was over. Best of luck everyone, she said. We all started jogging out into the marsh in time with then music. I just jogged around the statue with a couple of more girls. The youngest of us, Wisteria, who was 14, was actually trying to dance, skipping around and her plaited pigtails flying. Wisteria, honey, I heard Winter whisper to her. You're wasting energy, just jog, okay? Wisteria flushed with embarrassment as there was muffled laughter from the brunettes. After 10 minutes I already felt winded. Fear was overwhelming my chest. I was certain I was going to die out here and there was nothing I could do to stop it. If I ran off, I was alone. I couldn't return to my community as a deserter. I'd be lost in the forest and die of starvation or exposure. As I continued to jog around the statue, I tried to weigh up my options. What would be a worse way to die? Starving out in the wilderness, drowning, or bleeding to death? Each way made me feel sick, my skin soaked in clammy sweat. I looked around at the other girls. Briar hadn't even broken a sweat. Juniper was miserable and glowing red. Belladonna looked uncomfortable and Daffodil had a look of growing panic on her face. The brunettes were all jogging on the spot beside each other. I caught eyes with Winter. She was looking around worriedly at all of us. The end was like a stack of dominoes. We'd been dancing to the music for almost an hour with no problems. Then it all just went spectacularly wrong. "Look guys," Juniper said suddenly. We all turned to her. Her eyes were filled with quiet tears. "You all know I wouldn't have made it anyway," she said. "Might as well just quit." "What?" Winter said at once. "Juniper, don't. What do you think you're doing?" We watched as Juniper stopped dancing and sat down on the ground. She lay down on her side and the mud began to cover up the pink sweaty flesh of her arms and legs. "Don't!" Winter cried. "Juniper, stop it." I couldn't look, staring up at Rose Gold's veiled face as the slurping and gurgling of the mud filled my ears. The other girls were screaming for Juniper to stop it, to get up. Wisteria burst into frightened tears. Belladonna let out a groaning sound and then ran for the base of the statue. She clutched at it, her arms being cut up at once, as she vomited down her front. "Oh shit!" Winter shouted. "Quickly come over here and I'll try to bandage your arm up." As she jogged on the spot, she began to rip at the hem of her dress. Belladonna clutched at the statue base, glass sticking into her hands. She wavered dizzily, leaning entirely on the base, the jagged edges sticking into her stomach. "For God's sake, someone get her!" yelled Briar as she ran forward. She grabbed Belladonna by the shoulders and wrenched her away from the statue base back into the marsh. Not knowing her own strength, she ended up flinging Belladonna to the ground. Everyone was screaming as I just stared, my mouth hanging open. Briar tried to grab Belladonna's hand to pull her up, but she had fallen so hard, she was already halfway into the mud. Her hands stretched out, reaching for the sky as she sunk away. The mud enveloped her face, opened up in silent cry of terror. She was gone. The whole group was in hysterics. Daffodil was wheezing. She staggered, trying to keep on moving as she gasped for breath, tears rolling down her cheeks. Then she fell to her knees, curling up on the ground. "No, no, no!" screamed Winter, and I forced myself to look away again. Rose Gold was the only calm face, quietly watching over the mayhem and chaos. The music was still playing, drumming endlessly in my ears. My joints felt watery with exhaustion, my breath caught, my sides blaring with stitches. "I wasn't going to last long." "This is a fucking joke," Gwen said. "No one's forcing us to do this." Then she was running away from us, towards the solid ground. I felt like her footsteps fell in time with the music. Thump, thump, thumping in time. "You can't leave!" Briar screamed. "You selfish bitch!" Gwen turned on her over by the trees. "Just come with," she said. "No one's making you do shit." "Yeah, just fuck our whole culture and traditions, right?" Briar said. "If our traditions mean choosing between drowning or getting screwed by some freak in a goat costume, then yeah," Gwen replied. "You should be ashamed of yourself." Briar screamed at her, eyes wild, 2 red spots high on her cheeks. "That's rich coming from you, killer," Gwen sneered back. Then she looked around at us all. "Anyone coming?" she said. Fern and Hazel immediately ran over to her side. Wisteria and I exchanged nervous looks. I should have gone. I don't know why I stayed. I think I was intimidated by them. They were all 18 and 19 and I was younger and not a part of their clique. If I joined them, would I be their punching bag? No one said anything and Gwen sent us all contemptuous looks. She said everything with that look. "Enjoy dying or being molested, you absolute idiots." Without a second glance, she ran off into the forest, her loyal followers behind her. There were only 4 of us left now. Myself, Winter, Wisteria and Briar. Briar let out a choked sobbing sound. "I didn't mean to kill her," she said, voice breaking. "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to." Her eyes were popping, tears streaming down her face, mouth hanging open. The music kept on playing. I felt it boring into my mind like hungry insects. "It was just an accident," said Winter. "We know it wasn't on purpose." Briar began to cry, putting her face in her hands. The baby died too," she sobbed. The rest of us didn't know what to say. We just jogged helplessly on the spot, staring at Briar. She murmured something that we couldn't hear. "It's looking at me." We finally made it out. "It's looking at me. I can see her. She's staring. She's staring." She looked through her fingers at Rose Gold, a look of terror in her eyes. We all looked at the statue, that hadn't moved an inch since we started the dance. It just stood in its usual pose, head to the side, palms up like it was shrugging. "Briar, just breathe. It's okay. The statue's not looking at anything," Winter tried to say as Wistaria's whimpering grew stronger by the second. Briar let out an ungodly scream. Its eyes, can't you see its eyes?" she wailed. "She's looking, she's judging me. I can see it. Make her stop, make her stop." You couldn't even see the eyes of the statue properly, the veil covering it. But for some reason, Briar was seeing a staring judgmental gaze that didn't even exist. She was screaming, crying, horrified and hysterical. I'm sorry," she said, falling to her knees at the base of the statue. "I'm sorry, please." Her legs were beginning to sink into the mud, her arms clutching at the base, hands gushing blood at the glass and nails. "Come on," Winter said to us. "It's over." "Commande." Wisteria was still crying as we ran for solid ground. Looking behind my shoulder, I saw Briar, kneeling in the mud, sobbing at the base of the statue. I hadn't shed a single tear since the dance started. I think I was in shock. I felt numb and slightly dizzy, like I was about to faint. The three of us ran into the forest together, leaving Briar behind. I was alive. I had survived the Kothpo. There was a deafening scream from outside, and Tandy ran to the window. "Leith," she called. Leith was cowering in his car. His car lights illuminated the ghostly figure of Liam, standing in the road in front of Leith's car. He wasn't doing anything, just standing with his arms up in surrender. "I'm your father," said Liam to Aunt Andy with a desperate smile on his face. "I just want to come in and say hello." "Cup of tea?" "Isn't chamomile your favorite, dear Sky?" "Is that such a crime?" Sky moaned, wrapping his arms around his head. I heard the call of police sirens. Liam's pleasant expression twisted at once. "You called the cops on your own family?" he shouted, his eyes, mouth and nostrils like black pits in the white shine of the headlights. "How dare you!" The police rounded the corner. "You can't avoid destiny," he said as he backed away. "Rose Gold wants us to be reunited. You can't fight her." Then he ran for the fence that led to the forest. One of the police helped the hysterical Uncle Leith to the front door. "We'll go into the forest to look for him," the officer said. "He can't hide forever. You all just stay here, okay?" Aunt Andy muttered a thanks. She put Uncle Leith down on the couch and put a blanket over him. Dad got up to get him a drink. "I can't believe he's back," said Uncle Leith, voice shaking. "It's gonna be fine," said Aunt Andy. "The cops are after him now." Uncle Leith brushed away the tears with the back of his hand, exhaling hard. We found a statue of a woman down by the river. Part 5, The Great God Pan. I was at the final chapter, rapidly reaching the end. Only Lou and I were still awake, engrossed in the book, the adults napping in their seats. I tried not to look at the window as I read. I was afraid I'd see a face peering in at me. We'd come to the little area where the statue was, where the girls had danced to the death. There was no one there anymore. Glenn's breathing got all harsh. He must have been thinking about Belladonna. We quickly ran across the weird water, knowing if we slowed down we'd sink. I shivered thinking of how we were walking on the graves of about half a dozen girls. When we reached the trees, Sky looked over his shoulder at the base of the statue. Glenn and I looked over, but it was just the usual unintelligible symbols. Yet Sky seemed to be able to read them. "Hold my hand and make a wish, Rose Gold," he whispered as he read. "How can you read that?" I asked at once. Sky looked confused. "Huh?" he said. It's just regular words." We looked again. It was still just symbols to us. "You reckon it's changed to English just for Sky?" Glenn whispered. Then he let out a huge shaky gasp as Sky ran for the statue. He reached over to take her hand, glass and nails sticking into his leg. "I wish that my boyfriend Morris is okay," Sky said. "I wanna have a baby with him." Glenn and I were gobsmacked. We always knew Morris and Sky were close, but we'd never realized they were together. "Wait, you and Morris were dating?" Glenn said. As Sky ran back to us, he couldn't look us in the eye. Before he could answer there was a call of, "Over here." We looked over and saw 3 figures waving at us from the tree line. The surviving girls. We ran forward, Glenn at the front with a desperate, eager look on his face. We ran into the forest, finding Dandelion, Wisteria and Winter. Glenn's face fell at once. "I'm so happy you made it," Dandelion cried to Sky as they hugged. Glenn was silent, staring over at the marsh with Rose Gold standing in the middle. He squeezed his fists tight, staring down at his feet. His eyes were clouded over with tears and he was trying not to cry. "I'm so sorry," said Winter, putting her hand on his shoulder. Then she took the flare gun, pointing it at the morning sky. She shot it into the air and the pink light burst above the trees. We began to walk together for the clearing of love. We all sat in the grass together. From down in the main clearing I heard the sound of a horn being blown. "The Great Pan approaches," called out Liam's voice. The 6 of us exchanged uncomfortable looks. I think with all the shock and horror of the Kothpo, we'd temporarily forgotten what the prize was. We were going to have an orgy with each other and Liam. At once, everyone was on edge. Winter's face was drawn and harrowed. Sky was rocking back and forth on the spot and Glenn looked like he had swallowed vinegar. "Look, I was your regular hormone-addled teenage boy, but even I didn't want to take a part of this." Just imagining Liam leering over us as we awkwardly groped at each other made my skin crawl. "I don't want to have sex with Liam," Wisteria said in a tiny voice. She was only 13. "God," said Glenn in a disgusted voice. He looked around at us all. "Most of you are kids." "I'm 28. Winter, you're the next oldest and you're 20. You're all way too young. I don't want to sleep with any of you." He threw his hands up. "What about poor Dandelion and Sky? Does he expect you to participate with each other?" "And gods, he's your dad, Dandelion. This is sick. This is just sick." He got to his feet. In the distance, we heard clumping footsteps down the path getting closer and harsh, heavy breathing. "I'm not doing it," said Glenn. "Also fuck this whole community for standing by and letting it happen." Winter nodded as she got to her feet as well. "Gwen had the right idea," she said. "I'm getting out of this place." With that, the 2 oldest were running for the forest. We teenagers just stared among ourselves, slightly flabbergasted. At the tree line, Winter glanced around at us. She gestured madly. "Come on," she called. Getting to our feet, we blindly ran after her. All of this was just so insane. I think we were just going with the flow without a second thought. At that moment, if someone told me to get into a fist fight with Liam, I probably would have just did it. "What's going on?" Liam's voice called out. Looking behind me, I saw he'd reached the clearing. He was wearing his furry goat legs and horned headband, carrying a knapsack. Explaining this to people later on got a lot of laughs. In hindsight it was bizarrely funny. This man dressed as a goat, furious he wasn't getting laid. At the time it wasn't funny at all. "Where do you think you're going?" he screamed, red in the face. "What are you doing?" He dropped his knapsack to the ground and then charged at us. Fear gripped my body as I ran off after the others. There was a wailing sound as though something had been shot through the air. I looked around and saw something land in the bushes a few feet away. Then a resounding bang made me throw myself back, birds flying for the air with a screech. Pink smoke was billowing from the bushes, filling up the sky in huge clouds of color. I couldn't see through it at all, completely blinded. Soon it seemed like the whole forest was coated in pink. I'd lost sight of all the others. I heard them all shouting for each other. Normally we used smoke bombs for emergencies if we got lost during forest hikes. This, however, had been used as a complete attack to the senses. I ran through the clouds of pink, hearing Liam yell somewhere behind me. "How dare you disrespect your culture!" he screamed in a fury. "How dare you disrespect the great god Pan!" I coughed uncontrollably, my eyes streaming in the pink smoke. He'd brought this with him. He was prepared for us to fight back. If we didn't want to participate, he would have forced us. There was another wailing sound of something whizzing through the air. Something denoted, but I didn't see any smoke. Then all at once there were screams of pain and my face began to burn. My eyes and nose were streaming and I clutched at my face with agony, coughing and spitting up. All I thought as I staggered to and fro was, why the hell was this shit? In hindsight I realized it was a canister of tear gas. Why would he have tear gas? Did he just always carry that on him at all times? It might seem like a complete melodramatic overreaction, smoke bombing and tear gassing us because we ran away from his orgy. Yet I don't think deep down it was really about the sex. He was losing control of his cult and it had thrown him into a rage. I spotted Wisteria a few steps ahead, heaving for breath trying to rub her eyes. Liam emerged from the smoke and I saw him grab Wisteria by the plate, tugging her head back. Instantly I ran forward and pushed my hand into his face, feeling the crunch of his nose beneath my palm as blood spurted forward. He screamed with pain, letting Wisteria go. It was the only helpful thing I did this entire experience. Into the river. I heard Glenn yell as we coughed and sputtered, crashing about like stunned rabbits. "It'll wash it out." Grabbing Wisteria's arm we ran blindly towards the sound of rushing water. I saw ahead of me, Sky tripping over a tree branch into the river. I think Glenn just meant to wash out our eyes. But we were in such a mad panic, we all just jumped in instead. I heard Liam's shout behind us as I plunged into the icy water, pulling Wisteria with me. The whole world was a crashing, roaring rush of water as we were swept away. I slowly awoke to the gently sound of the running river and water dripping. I was staring up at the dark stone of a cave wall. I looked to my side. Curled up on the damp cave floor was everyone else and we were all beginning to wake up. I became aware of a presence behind us and the shadow of a shape just moving slightly. "Now don't turn around, okay?" someone said. "Look forward." We all immediately obeyed. Being alone in a cave and hearing a deep male voice would probably terrify anyone else. But there was very calm atmosphere in the cave. The voice was friendly and soothing. I felt totally at ease. "So what's the matter with you all?" said the voice. Although he sounded nice, we were too shy to answer. Sky had his head buried in Dandelion's arm and she was stroking his hair comfortingly. "We trying to get out of this forest." Glenn finally spoke up. "Why's that now?" the voice said. Glenn explained everything that had happened, the figure only interrupting Tom and Han. "So the prize was to have sex with Pan, eh?" the voice said. "Very flattering. Sorry though. Most of you look a bit too young. Also it doesn't look like you even really want to, do you?" I shook my head, feeling the others move beside me. At the time, the words didn't really make an impact but afterwards they haunted me. "Oh my dears, you've gone through such a terrible ordeal," the figure said. "It's okay. Now if you walk out of this cave, you'll see a path that will lead you back to the human world away from here. All you have to do is follow it. And whatever you do, don't turn around until you reach the human road. Keep looking forward. Do you understand?" We all nodded and said our affirmations. "Lovely," he said. "Off you go now." Getting to our feet, we walked out of the mouth of the cave and onto the river bank. I noticed Sky was carrying a sodden backpack which he opened, revealing a waterproof interior filled with food. We all stared at him. "When he did the pink smoke, he left his bag behind," he said. "So I took it." He started passing out bread with butter, cheese and apples and then an oilskin of wine. We all muttered thanks as we greedily ate and drank. As we devoured the food, we stared up at the narrow muddy path that the mysterious figure had told us to walk. It was so steep. It was like walking up a wall. The river roared all around us and it slowly dawned on us that not only would it be exhausting to walk, if we misstepped, we'd tumble into the raging waters below. I felt myself on the edge of completely losing my mind. After all of this, The final part was another absolute nightmare. Alright, Winter sighed. Come on everyone. We moved forward to the beginning of the slope. Sky stepped down on his foot and gasped with pain. It was the leg that had been cut on the base of the statue, the one that had been caught by a branch when he'd tumbled into the river. Hurts, he whimpered, hopping on the spot. Can't walk. I'm sorry. It's not your fault, said Dandelion. She put an arm around his shoulder and Sky put his weight on her. She helped him walk towards the slope. We used the branches growing to the side to help pull ourselves up. The higher we got, the more deadly the drop became. Falling into the river at that height would break every bone in the body. Soon we were gasping for breath and drenched in sweat, struggling through the mud. A stitch burned in my side and my lungs screamed for oxygen. I was really thankful I'd eaten. I don't know how we would have done it hungry and thirsty. We were halfway up when Glenn slipped. The branch he was holding snapped under his hand. He thumped to the ground and began to slide down. Wisteria turned to grab at him as Dandelion yelled, "No, don't." Wisteria froze on the spot, her face twitching and her eyes bugging out, her mouth wide open. For a few moments I didn't know what was wrong. Had she seen something? I almost turned to look and Dandelion grabbed my hand. "Remember what he said," she hissed. "Whatever you do, don't turn around." I felt an icy chill go through me. I heard Glenn's helpless yell and then a resounding crash of something hitting the water. Then Wisteria's hands flew to the sides of her head, fingers digging into her hair. She let out a horrible wail. She began to thrash from side to side, still screaming. She started to pull out her own hair, nails gouging into her scalp leaving bloody trails behind. Winter rushed to her, grabbing her around the middle. "It's okay, it's okay," she said, trying to calm her. Then all at once, Wisteria wrenched violently to the side, throwing herself off the edge of the path, taking Winter with her. They both crashed into the raging river and were swept away under the current. Dandelion, Sky and I just stood there in silence for what seemed like years. Sky still had his face hidden in his sister's arms, his injured leg slick with blood as Dandelion hugged him in a vice grip. We didn't say or do anything, just stood there, listening to the sounds of the birds chirping and the breeze blowing and the river rushing. It was like something had snapped in my mind. I completely fell apart, leaning over sideways into the bushes and sobbing uncontrollably. "I can't do it, I can't," I cried. "They're all dead, they're all dead." What was that back there in the cave? This is just mad. This is just fucking mad. I think I was on the same path as Briar and Forest, on the edge of having a breakdown from the trauma. "Get up," Dandelion hissed at me, grabbing my arm. "Get up, goddammit." I cried like a baby throwing a tantrum, unable to find the strength to walk, my face a mess of blubbering tears. Dandelion dragged two hysterical teenage boys up the rest of that ungodly steep muddy hill, Sky under one arm, crying into her chest, dragging me along with the other arm. She didn't fall once. If she'd have slipped even slightly, we all would have ended up dead. Above us, we could see the ground evening out. She fell to the solid earth, cutting up her knees and palms. Then she vomited up all the bread, apples and wine. Out of everything that had happened, that was what I'm most ashamed of, that I had to be dragged to safety. Sky couldn't help it. He was injured, but I should have pulled it together. Judge me all you want, I definitely deserve it. If it wasn't for Dandelion, I would have ended up floating dead in the river like so many of the others. A few steps away was a metal traffic barrier and beyond was a busy highway. Dandelion flagged down a car, something we'd never seen before in our lives. When the ambulance and police came, I was such a mess they had to sedate me. I don't remember much of my hospital stay. I think I just slept for most it. Sky almost lost his leg to infection, but he pulled through with only a limp. After all of that, we'd made it. Afterwards, Dandelion and I did turn to each other for comfort and ended up having a baby, Eloise. We didn't really have romantic feelings though. It was more just we'd survived such a traumatic event together. So me, Dandelion and Sky were the only known survivors. The authorities raided the valley and rounded up Liam and the rest of the cult. Even after the trial, they didn't reform. They all must have seen Liam's rampage with the smoke bomb and the tear gas. He'd presented himself as this loving hippie leader when in reality he had kept weapons to attack anyone who tried to escape. Instead of a happy community, they found that they had unknowingly been taken hostage the entire time. Even though no one stayed with Liam, none of them testified against him either. Fear, I guess. We've never found Gwen, Fern and Hazel. There are rumors that there are witches in the valley, which might have just been sightings of them. Either they're still there or they escaped into society and preferred to shun the spotlight, or they're dead. Who knows? The river and swamp was dragged and the bodies of everyone except Briar, Morris and Rowan were found. We still don't know if they survived, and if they did survive, where the hell they are. The authorities took Rose Gold to be tested and investigated in a lab by scientists. Something bizarre was happening to it. She grew a human womb and a baby started to form inside it. No one knew how the hell it was happening, how the baby was getting nutrients, how the womb could exist without any other internal organs, how in the hell an inanimate object could get pregnant. Rose Gold was carefully monitored until one day, the golden metal stomach opened up like a clamshell and the screaming baby was born. It was whisked away to be tested. The DNA came back saying it was Morris and Sky's baby. Rose Gold had carried the child as a surrogate somehow. This absolutely baffled everyone who heard about it. My brain hurts just thinking about it for too long. Look, we can't really explain it logically. Rose Gold defies logic. All we knew is that although Morris was still missing, Sky's wish had come true. He had Morris's baby, which meant that Morris must be still alive somehow. Yet we still never found him despite putting his name and image out on television. Sky named the baby Francis. Rose Gold went missing soon after that. The secret of the mysterious, magical artifact was all over the news and the lab was broken into. Authorities tracked the thief down to a shabby apartment where he admitted to selling it on the black market. The buyers had ended up in a shoot-up over the statue with no survivors. Witnesses say they saw a man carrying a statue run into the forest before getting shot in the back of the head. When he fell to the ground, the statue tumbled down a ravine and into the roaring river. I always reckoned Rose Gold had manipulated her way back home again. Everyone has their theories about Rose Gold, that she's a cursed statue from ancient times or she's an alien that fell to Earth. She was thoroughly investigated and we were told she wasn't made from ancient or alien metal. She was a replica of a sculpture made in the 1840s, the Veiled Vestal Virgin by Raphael Monti. The original was in a place called Chatsworth House in England. She was just a trinket made by an ordinary person, made to be sold in a gift shop. No, there's nothing extraordinary about her shell. It's just there's something in there, something we couldn't pick up with our technology. I think it's some peculiar spirit. I don't believe in heaven or hell, but maybe if you do believe in all of that, you'd say it was a demonic possession. Maybe it's an interdimensional spirit or a powerful ghost. I don't know. None of the theorists ever saw Rose Gold, cause if they did they wouldn't say it was a devil possession. She just didn't give off a malicious vibe, an unearthly vibe. Sure, that made all the hairs on your neck stand up and your skin crawl. But a maggot eating the wound of a living person wasn't evil, even if it was hurting someone. It was just doing what it had to do to survive. That's how I think of Rose Gold. She hurt us, but it wasn't with ill intent. It was just doing what was natural for her. Even though everyone who's ever seen her agree she wasn't evil, we all agreed that we never wanted to see her again. We found a statue of a woman down by the river, Part 6, Final. The police rang us and said they looked everywhere and couldn't find Liam. I feel like Rose Gold was probably just keeping them away somehow. I stared down at the photos at the back of the book and then breathed out hard. I watched Lou, who was still reading, her face furrowed up and her mouth hanging open. After 10 minutes, she closed the book as well. She stared at me. "Hi there, Rose Jr. she said, and I just shook my head. It sounded too mad to comprehend. I'd been born from a statue. Born from a statue. It was ridiculous. It was bizarre. I had another father out there in the world somewhere. A statue had given birth to me. A chunk of metal shaped like a woman. It didn't make sense. This was all too goddamn crazy. What did you kids wish for? Aunt Andy said, turning to us. I saw Lou flush bright red, glancing awkwardly at my dad. I'd been so wrapped up in the book, I'd forgotten our wishes. Something uncomfortable shifted in my chest. I wished that I could find out about my mom, I said. It came true. Rose Gold was my surrogate mother. Aunt Andy turned to her daughter. Lou couldn't look any of us in the eye. It was just a joke, said Lou in a tiny voice. I said, I'd wish for Uncle Sky too. She flushed with humiliation. It was Valentine's Day, so he should find a special someone to have a special time with, I said. Aunt Andy's nostrils flared and her eyes flashed. Uncle Leith shot his daughter a look of deep disapproval. That's a sick joke, Lou, he said. Then he exchanged looks with Aunt Andy. An expression of dawning understanding crossed his face. Is that why Rose Gold brought Liam here? He said. Aunt Andy's eyes were filled with fire, her jaw set and her hands shaking with barely subdued rage. Rose Gold brought him here, she said. Liam who fucking molested Sky as a kid, the monkey's paw is his fucking abuser, comes back into his life. Rose Gold is trying to set up for Sky to be raped. That is. She leapt to her feet and Lou and I shrunk back in our seats. We watched as Aunt Andy marched through the house, slamming through the back door. She was heading for the shed. We raced to the front window. Aunt Andy was now storming down the driveway. She was carrying a tin of gasoline and a bunch of rags. Lou raced off after her mother. Stop! Yelled Uncle Leith, jumping to his feet. Come back here, Eloise. He raced off after her and Dad was on his heel. He looked over at me and then stuck out his hand. I took it and we ran off, Dad limping, after the rest of our family. We went into the forest at the end of our street, running through the darkness, crickets chirping, bugs buzzing, the river running in the distance. Was it this river? I asked. Dad shook his head. No, he said. We are far, far away from it. I was silent for a few moments. Do I look like Morris? I asked in a small voice. Dad and I had the same color hair, but apart from that I didn't look much like him. My dad had a very soft innocent face and mine was more sharp and angular. I had a big nose, narrow eyes, thin lips and bushy eyebrows. Were these Morris's features? Did I look more like him? Dad smiled at me, but it didn't reach his eyes so much, he said. There was a scream in the distance and I saw orange flames shoot up, crackling bright through the black darkness. No! I heard the voice of Liam scream. Stop! Stop! We reached the part of the river where Lou and I had found the statue. Rose Gold was upright and melting, her calm still face dripping into a grotesque clear. What have you done? Liam wailed at Aunt Andy. Her face was cold as she watched the statue burn. Did kill off Sky's dad so you could get to Polly? Aunt Andy asked. Was the second one so you could rape Sky? What disgusting accusations, Liam said at once. Not lies, my dad said by my side and everyone turned to look at him. In the bath. You hurt me. Said I looked just like my mother. Liam's eyes flickered from side to side. You're not remembering correctly, Sky, he said like he was speaking to a toddler. You've never been very smart. You probably just had a nightmare. Then he stared up at the collapsing Rose Gold, his face shining with orange light. I created the Kothpo all on my own, he said. When I found Rose Gold I wished for power, but she didn't give me the skills to properly handle power, so it was like a stack of cards. When small it's easier to control, the larger it got the more unstable, the more likely it is to fall. My monkey's paw is that I lived a life of paranoia trying to keep the card tower from tumbling. He gestured at Sky. You wished for Morris to be okay and to have a child with him, but you didn't wish that you would see him again, so you've been separated for years with a child who looks exactly like him as a reminder of what you've lost. A strong smell hit us, stopping the conversation in its tracks, an overwhelming stink of roses, like having a bottle of perfume dumped all over your head. I put my hand over my mouth, choking. From Rose Gold's melted head, a dark pink liquid was leaking down her front, dripping from her outstretched arms. It was coming from somewhere deep inside her. Liam's eyes lit up. It must be her wish power, Liam said. He turned to us and grinned. Just think of the money you could get from it. Your every wish come true. Jesus, don't touch it, I yelled as he launched forward with cupped hands. There was a screeching sound of metal as Rose Gold's head fell from her neck. Then Dad's hand was over my eyes, shielding me from what was happening. There was a sizzling sound of cooking meat and a scream of agony. I didn't fight against Dad. I didn't want to see it. The ambulance came, wheeling Liam in the body bag into the back of it. I kinda felt after everything he'd done it was too easy a death. I wished he could have survived for a little longer and suffered with the burns before dying. Lou and I sat on a rock down the path as the adults watched Rose Gold melt into a puddle of gold and pink. She washed away into the water and down the river. Lou had a gaping look on her face, eyes glazed over. Uncle Sky covered your eyes, she said. Dad didn't cover mine. I saw it all. She looked over at where the burning statue lit up the night. Rose Gold must be dead for real, she said. My wish hasn't come true. I nodded. Thank God, I said. I saw the grown-ups walking towards us, hand in hand with each other. I don't want to watch it anymore, said Aunt Andy. She sounded exhausted. Come on, let's all go get some rest, said Uncle Leith. We walked together towards the house. The familiar figure of the postie stood in the distance, getting off his motorbike. He stood stock still in the middle of the footpath, just staring at us. Shit, he said. Shit, shit. He took off his helmet. His face was sharp and angular and he had a big nose, narrow eyes, thin lips and bushy eyebrows. On his chin was an old scar. Morris? Said Sky, clutching at his chest. They ran up to each other as the rest of us boggled in shock. Sky and Morris hugged each other so tight I thought they'd break each other's spines. Morris stroked Dad's hair in an automatic soothing motion. You've been here the whole time? Morris said, voice choked up. The post was always to Andy King. I didn't put two and two together that it was Dandelion with Polly's surname. Witness protection, Sky murmured back. Then Morris looked over at me. How didn't I know? She's my splitting image. He said, it's so good to meet you properly, Francis. I read about you in a book. Aunt Andy and Uncle Leith looked absolutely delighted, wiping away tears and laughing helplessly. Lou and I just stared at each other. She's not dead, Lou whispered to me. She's still alive. I am older now, about to leave school for university. I think maybe the monkey's paw of Morris and Sky being reunited is that we're always anxious for something to go wrong, afraid that Rose Gold's influence was about to ruin everything. I take after Morris a lot. All through my teenage years, he'd take me to aquariums, museums and zoos and was always very interested in my schoolwork. It didn't take long for me to get as close to him as I was with Sky. The years knowing him as the postie certainly helped us to bond, him not being a complete stranger who burst out of nowhere into my life. I wish to know about my mother and the monkey's paw is that I found out I was born in an impossible way with an otherworldly creature as a surrogate. I dream about Rose Gold constantly, the melting lair, the hieroglyphics changing to 1,000 different languages. Sometimes I wonder if being inside her metal stomach influenced me in any way. Would I ever start to turn to gold? Every incident of good luck was eerie. Had I made it come true? I don't think Rose Gold is gone. She's probably reformed somewhere far away, waiting for someone to find her again. I'm not sure what she gets out of making disastrous wishes come true for us. I really don't understand her motives at all. Maybe she feeds on chaos and unhappiness. Maybe she was actually trying to help but just didn't know how badly she was screwing people over. I've no idea. I think we'll be trying to work her out forever. I just know that I never, ever want to see her again.